All right, now for your section 6 notes over patterns of inheritance. Right, your objectives in this section are to describe different types and rates of evolution and then to compare different types and rates of extinction. So obviously, I have these two terms here that I'm emphasizing. Understand that they're kind of opposites of each other, right? Because remember, evolution is all about survival. If you evolve, you survive. As long as that Earth is changing, those species are going to have to change with it in order to survive. Whereas if they can't change, that's when they go extinct. Because if they don't survive, then there's nothing left to worry about. So we're worried about these species' survival, and that's where these two things come into play. They're opposites of each other. If you evolve, you survive. If you're extinct, you obviously didn't. And you obviously didn't evolve. But evolution through natural selection is not random, right? Remember, if you're selecting, that means that there's something that's an advantage and it's not going to be random. Those things are what are being passed on, not the things that are unadvantageous, those things that don't help you survive, right? So there's always some kind of rhyme or reason in that natural selection. But we have two different types of evolution here to talk about. And basically, we need to talk about these because we've talked about it before, right? Convergent evolution is the evolution of similar characteristics in unrelated species, right? That should be familiar to you, right? If things are similar, but they're unrelated, they superficially seem like they could be related, but they're actually unrelated. That's that term from last chapter. That's going to be an analogous example, right? So we have these two terms, convergent, divergent, right? Convergent is analogous, right? They happen to be similar, but that's because they evolved to similar conditions, and they come up with similar characteristics because of that. Bats and birds both fly, but that does not mean that they're related. That's an example of convergent evolution. They end up with similar traits, but that does not necessarily mean that they're related. Whereas divergent evolution would be the opposite, right? That means they end up evolving in different directions. They started out similar, but they've become more and more different since then. And so even though it's kind of hard to tell that certain things are related, they may be. They've just changed over time because the Earth is changing around them, right? So we would assume that these things are related. That would make these examples homologous for sure. But convergent examples are analogous, divergent examples are homologous. So when you could decide eventually that two species were more closely related to each other, that would be an example of divergent evolution. They should have a common ancestor, and at which point, when they were that ancestor, they weren't really different from each other. They've become different as they've evolved to different situations in their environment. So divergent evolution leads to different traits, even though they're related. Convergent evolution makes things that started out different become similar to each other. So one's analogous, one's homologous. So I'd ask you about a question like the bottom here. Are the shells of snails and turtles examples of convergent or divergent evolution? Remember, I always gave you some kind of curveball in every example we did. Snails and turtles both have shells, but is that coincidental or is that because they're related? Now, knowing what you know, I would assume you realize that snails do not have a backbone. Turtles, on the other hand, do, right? Since one is a vertebrate, the other one is not, and that would be more internal type structures. Then you would probably guess that that shell is an example of convergent evolution, right? And your reasoning, your explanation would be that it's a coincidence that they have that thing in common, right? It's more likely to be analogous, right? And your evidence really should point out why they're not related, not so much, you know, saying this is a coincidence. You know it's a coincidence because turtles have bones, snails don't. And that would be a good reason to believe that they're not related to each other. Right? So we know that it's convergent because they're not likely to be related to each other when one's a vertebrate and the other one's not. So the shells just have to be a coincidence. Okay, coevolution, right, is the process in which two species in close relationships evolve together in response to one another. A lot of times this is going to be an example of an evolutionary arms race. Right, so I'm gonna give you one example here. We might talk about a couple more in class, but my first example would be like with a crab, right? A crab has one feature that obviously gives it an advantage. It has that pincer, it has that claw, right? And it's gonna use that claw to obtain its food, right? And if you look at the evolution of crabs, right, compared to a normal distribution, some of those crabs may have very small claws and pincers. Some of them may have very large and strong claws and pincers, right? And if it's an advantage to have those larger, stronger claws, then you might see some selection against this small. It's going to push that. We're going to have a directional selection, making those claws bigger and bigger and stronger, right? But the reason why that crab might need a big, strong claw is because its food might be like that snail example from before. With that being said, the snail has some protection against that crab. The snail has that shell to protect it, which again is the reason why the crab might need a bigger pincer, a stronger pincer to break through that shell so it can get to its food. With that being said, the snail also has a normal distribution of some trait, right? Some of the snails have very weak shells. Other snails have very strong and spiny shells. And you can imagine why they would want a stronger, spiny, protective shell, right? So crabs are evolving. They're getting bigger and stronger claws for a reason, but the snails should be evolving at the same time. Right? The crabs are going to eat all this snails with the weaker shells. So it's likely that there's an example of coevolution here, right? Both things would be evolving at the same time. The crab's claws would be getting bigger and stronger, but the snail's shells are also going to get stronger and stronger and stronger as time goes on. So they're both evolving together and essentially with and against one another. So as the crab evolves, the snail also has to evolve, and vice versa. If the snail evolved first and its shells got stronger, that would mean that the crabs need to have bigger, stronger pincers to break through those shells. So as long as you have two species in a close relationship that are evolving together, so you got a crab and a snail, you got predator-prey, that there's always going to be some kind of coevolution. As one gains an advantage, the other one's going to flip that and try and get that advantage back.